It's a great honor to introduce our speaker this evening, Mr. Mohsin Hamid. I'd also like to thank the many communities and institutions on campus who've also contributed a great deal to make this event possible. These include the Department of Religious Studies, the Tawi Center for Jewish Studies, the Stanford Initiative for Religious and Ethnic Understanding and Existence, Mutual Coexistence, the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society, and perhaps, it's along this, the Center for Comparative Studies of Race and Ethnicity. Basically, that's everyone on campus. If I were larger, I would be better twisting your arms. You see how much we wanted you to be here with us today, through all the movements of Chicago. I don't know if he doesn't really need an introduction. I'd like to just say a few brief words for those of us who may need a reminder. Originally from Lahore, Pakistan, Mohsin Hamid is the author of three major novels, three critically acclaimed novels, which speak to Pakistan and to the world. The most recent one, which by the way is outside for you to purchase, How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, just appeared last year. It's getting wonderful reviews. Last year was another very important year because his novel, Reluctant Fundamentalist, of 2007, was made into a film directed by Mira Nair, which is also wonderful, though it differs from the novel. Perhaps we can ask him to comment on the interaction of novels and film. His first novel, which is really another very important work of 2007, is entitled Moth Smoke. And it's a beautiful work about contemporary Pakistan, but also invites us to think about the Mughal past, the broader South Asian past, through a very clever literary device, which helps us think about Shah Jahan and his sons. So it speaks to a number of different subjects and registers. So Mohsin Hamid was educated at Princeton University, where he studied at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. I won't divulge anything more about his ties to Stanford, which he can do himself if he'd like. But he apparently has, I discovered tonight, very deep ties to our university, which is wonderful to hear. And then he studied law at Harvard before embarking on other things, before finding his career as a writer. So, again, he's celebrated by readers, artists, and critics alike as one of the greatest stylists, I think, of our generation, of his generation. I would add humorist and many other things. But for our purposes, in the university context, I'd also highlight his very important contribution to some of our broader concerns about the representation of Islam, about Muslims, and about understanding our world since 9/11. So in this context, I've actually taught the Reluctant Fundamentalist to high school students here from East Palo Alto, from Pescadero, mostly Catholic Latino kids from schools that are struggling to some degree. And the course was an attempt to imagine a kind of global history of our world since 9/11. And Mohsin Hamid's book was really, I think, the kernel of the course, and it did more than any other text there to help these young, mostly Latino kids understand our world, understand America's place in it, and to see something in themselves in a Muslim Pakistani. So that for that achievement, I give him all the more credit. Beyond all the stylistic brilliance, the comedy, and everything else that is in his work, this is a rare instance in which we have a living author who has so much to say about our contemporary world in a way that's meaningful for historians and other scholars who are attempting to identify text, which helps students to come to grips with our very complex present, our global present. So in that sense, I think his work is important for so many ways, and we're so grateful to have him here. I will turn it forward to him now. He's agreed to say a few remarks. He will then take some questions, and then he will sign a few books out front afterwards. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me back to Stanford. Stanford has a special place for me because I sort of began my education at Stanford. My dad did his PhD here, and so I was living in Stanford, California from 1974 to 1980 in Escondido Village as a 3-year-old. In fact, one of my dad's best friends probably his best friend, in fact, from his Stanford days, Blake Downing, is sitting in the audience. So there's a real family connection for me to be here in this room with you. But when I moved to California in 1974, I spoke Urdu fluently. I moved from Pakistan. My dad had gotten into the economics program. He was doing his PhD here. And my mother, my father, and I flew over. And moved into one of those townhouses in Eskimo Village, which you've seen. They all look exactly the same. And one day, shortly after we moved in, my mother heard crying, and went into the shared common lawn in front of this townhouse, and discovered that I was standing in front of the neighbor's townhouse. The neighbor was looking down at me, a bit perplexed. Why is this kid here? I was looking at the neighbor, perplexed. This is clearly not my mother. And I was surrounded by a group of young kids. And they asked my mother, well, why can't he talk? And she said, he can talk, but he just doesn't speak English. Anyway, I went inside, and then I didn't speak for a month, my parents tell me. And they were worried because it was very unusual for me to not speak for more than 5 minutes. And so a month, my mother thought, we should take him to see a doctor. My father said, no, he'll be okay. And a month later, when I began to speak, I spoke English, incomplete sentences, and with an American accent. And then I ventured forth, into the world as a little Californian English-speaking kid. And I'm telling you this story in part because for me, what it means is that not only do I have a tie to Stanford, but that I don't really have a first language. English is my second language, but it's my best language. Since the age of 3, it's been the language I speak better than any other. When I went back to Pakistan in 1980, my father finished his PhD. My mother was working at Ampex down in Redwood City. My sister was born here, and then we moved back to Pakistan in 1980. And at that point, my parents discovered that I'd forgotten my Urdu. And so English is my second language, but it's my best language. I had to relearn Urdu at the age of 9. I went to school in Pakistan and learned how to speak and write and go to school in Urdu as well. But Urdu is now my third language in a way. It was my first, but I lost it as a first language. So my English is better than my Urdu. And as a result, I'm somebody who, is in a very real sense, it's sort of impossible for me to pretend that I belong completely to any one group. Linguistically, I cut across groups nationally. I've lived in Pakistan, in America, in the UK. And so I've always, I guess, in a way, been resistant to the idea that you can take groups at face value. And even now, when people in Pakistan ask me, how do American readers respond to Reluctant Fundamentalist? I always answer, there's no such thing as American readers. There's 300 million different people in America, and they each read, differently. And similarly, when I'm asked about Pakistan, what do Pakistanis think about this? My answer is sort of similar, which is to say that there's 180 million different Pakistanis, and there's a very wide variety of viewpoints. And a lot of what I've been trying to do in my writing subsequently is to sort of recomplicate, I think, what's been oversimplified. The idea that there is this America and this Pakistan, and they are like individuals, and each has a point of view. I think people like me are kind of evidence that can't entirely be true. So I spent my teens in Pakistan, came back to America in 1989 to study at Princeton. And while I was at Princeton, I enrolled in a creative writing course. I didn't major in creative writing, but I took some creative writing courses with Joyce Carol Oates and with Toni Morrison. And completely fell in love with the idea of writing fiction. I suppose I'd always been a kind of fantasist. I was the kind of kid who you could leave me alone with a bunch of blocks, and I would just, imagine that they were a fortress or a mountain or whatever. When I was in Eskimo Village, going to elementary school not far away from here, I wrote, just after Star Wars came out, a little galactic space opera with, stick figure illustrations based on Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica and Buck Rogers and all the other sci-fi TV shows and movies of the 1970s. So I've always been a bit of a fantasist, but I never really thought that I would write fiction for a living. I'm still not convinced anybody can write fiction for a living, although I'm doing it full-time at the moment. But I went to college, and I discovered I really loved doing this. And so I took a year off to work on my first novel, Moth Smoke. And in a sense, what I wanted to do in this novel, I'll tell you a little bit about it. I wanted to write about a Pakistan and a South Asia that I hadn't really seen much represented in fiction, but yet was the milieu, from which I came. And in particular, in the 1980s, when I was growing up in Lahore, another Afghanistan war was going on. In those days, the Soviet Union had occupied Afghanistan and was supporting a regime, ostensibly a communist regime, and for similar purposes they were saying that that this is a more secular regime, it protects women's rights, it's much more progressive, and the Mujahideen were being portrayed by the Soviets as a regressive, retrograde, bunch of religious maniacs. But Pakistan and America, of course, were engaged in arming and equipping the Mujahideen to go fight their jihad against the Soviet Union, with much blowback for both countries, but particularly Pakistan, as we all now know. But growing up in that place in the 1980s, a few things were going on. The first was we had a dictator ruling Pakistan named Zia-ul-Haq, and he was engaged in a process of Islamization, trying to make the country more Muslim somehow. Pakistan's a country where 97% of people self-identify as Muslim, so it's a little hard to make it more Muslim, but he managed, and horrifically. And so what wound up happening for those of us who were growing up in those days was, first of all, there were all kinds of legal changes that came in. Democracy was shelved. Quote-unquote Islamic laws were being introduced that curtailed women's rights, that curtailed minority rights, that involved punishments like flogging and all sorts of things. Most of which passed over my head, but as a teenager, what we saw was there was a massive increase in drugs and weapons in the city of Lahore. So when I moved back in 1980, Lahore was a city where, as a 9-year-old, you could hop on your bicycle and bike for 5 miles, on a Thursday evening. In those days, Friday was the weekend. Thursday evening to your grandfather's house, and nobody would think twice about it. By the time I left, of course, it was a very different city. Lahore, Pakistan, 1980 had almost no heroin addicts. By 1989, had 1 million. And what happened was that a big part of the economy of the sort of Afghanistan war economy and warlord economy was financed through heroin production, and so this heroin was being produced, of course, during the war. On top of that, because of the alliance with the United States, Pakistan signed up to sort of to control the outflow of heroin from Pakistan to the rest of the world, which was only partially successful. A lot of heroin still left Pakistan for Europe and America and elsewhere, but a lot of it stayed. And in the process of preventing a lot of heroin from leaving, I think the drug industry, the drug mafia, realized, well, there's a lot of potential heroin users here. So I grew up in a city where heroin use was increasing rapidly. Hash was, marijuana was very widely available, becoming more and more widely available because alcohol was being curtailed as a non-Islamic drug. So hash was proliferating, and guns. There's a huge amount of weaponry that was flowing into the Afghanistan war, and so Lahore was suddenly flooded with AK-47s. It became not unusual to see, people, having guards at their houses who were armed with Kalashnikovs. When I arrived in Lahore, there were no guards at people's gates, and people left their front doors open for the most part. But by 1989, Lahore, had changed in a way that we've seen many other countries change. The way that Mexico has changed, the way that Colombia has changed. We sometimes look around the world at countries and imagine there's very different stories for how they became as violent as they are. But oftentimes the stories are actually quite similar. So I wanted to write a novel about this urban reality, of pot smoking, occasionally hard partying, money conscious, sometimes armed, urban reality of contemporary Lahore, and that's what became Moth Smoke, my first novel. It was, as Roberts told you, it took as a frame a story that took place in the Mughal Empire, perhaps 350 years ago, or 400 years ago. And the Mughals, the name comes from Mongol, were one of many people who invaded and conquered South Asia, and were Muslim rulers of this place. And one particularly important moment in the succession of the empire took place when Shah Jahan had to pass power to his kids. And the Mughals, like the Mongols, had a very meritocratic system of deciding who the next king was going to be. It was, sort of an up or out promotion mechanism. And the way it worked was all of the children of the Mughal king, emperor, would fight to the death, and the one who lived was the one who should be king. So a great titanic battle began. And this battle involved, among others, two young men who had spent a big chunk of their childhood in Lahore, Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh. Dara Shikoh was a cosmopolitan heir. He believed, and he was much beloved of non-Muslim subjects and the court. He translated the Upanishads, the Hindu Upanishads, into Persian. He was a wine drinker and a poet. He was accused of apostasy and sentenced to death by his brother Aurangzeb when Aurangzeb won. Aurangzeb himself was a very severe young man, not much loved by his father, and he was sent off to fight these unwinnable military campaigns, off to fight the Iranian border, the Afghan border, South India, etc. His dad didn't much like him and kept sending him off to fight these battles, expecting he would die, but he never did. And there's a wonderful, in fact, if you are at all interested, the letters that Aurangzeb writes to his father still exist, and they're available also in English translation. So you can read Aurangzeb writing to his dad. And it's quite beautiful to read this young man saying, well, Dad, you sent me off to do this, and I've done it. Please bring me back to Delhi. I miss your company, etc. And his father says, no. Now you head off to meet some other bunch of merciless barbarians. And what happened as a result of this was, inside Aurangzeb, of course, a certain anger was festering, but also he became an incredibly skilled commander of men, warrior. He was battle-hardened. And so, when Shah Jahan's health began to fail him, and the battle to determine who would succeed him was waged, Aurangzeb comes back towards Delhi and Agra, the capitals, and Lahore. And he defeats the much larger army of Dara Shikoh and also the armies of his brothers, imprisons his own father opposite the Taj Mahal, which was built as a symbol of love by Shah Jahan for Shah Jahan's wife Mumtaz, Aurangzeb's father and mother. Imprisons his dad, gets Dara Shikoh, has him tried for apostasy, the crime of as a Muslim, in a sense, either renouncing Islam or behaving in a way which is anathema to Islam, has his head chopped off, and launches the Mughal Empire in a much more puritanical form. There are pogroms against the Sikhs under Aurangzeb, and in fact, some people would say that a big part of the massive bloodshed that took place in the Punjab at partition can be traced to the venality with which Aurangzeb persecuted Sikhs and others during his reign. So I wanted to kind of retell this story in contemporary Lahore. And Moth Smoke conjures up these historical figures. but Darashiko now is a pot-smoking ex-banker who falls in love with his best friend's wife. And Aurangzeb is the son of a corrupt bureaucrat. Neither is particularly religious in the novel. And Mumtaz, who of course is their mother historically, becomes the wife of one and the lover of the other in the novel, and a sort of a contest between them ensues. This novel was published in the year 2000, and when it came out, before it came out, there was some concern. For example, my Indian publisher, Penguin India, wondered, whether this would ruffle feathers, whether this kind of take on life in a Muslim country, in quotes, would be okay. As it turned out, nothing much. I didn't really encounter any real backlash on Moth Smoke. Some people didn't like it. Many people didn't believe it. A lot of the older generation in Pakistan would say things like, come on, this stuff doesn't happen in Pakistan. All this sex and drugs. And one of my granduncles, my father's uncle, paternal granduncle, who had been on the Supreme Court of Pakistan, was a retired Chief Justice, called me to his house, having read the book. And he looked at me sort of severely, said, "I've read your book." This is my paternal granduncle. And he said, "You've clearly gone on your mother's side of the family." and that was pretty much as bad as it got. Some people didn't like it, obviously. It was made into a television telefilm on Geo as called Daira. That was an adaptation which took place in 2003. But by and large, I was surprised by Pakistan's. I'm not surprised by it. I was reassured that the reception the book had was. I suppose many people ignored it. Most people had no idea it existed, but it didn't engender any kind of a backlash that I was aware of. And it reminded me that Pakistan has such a long tradition of writing and critique, and very often of profanity. Manto, the most famous short story writer from Lahore, was often very profane. And Lahore itself, the most famous shrine in Lahore, which we call Data Sahib, was named after Al-Hajwari, who was 1,000 years ago a Sufi scholar, most noted for writing a multi-volume treatise on sort of the Sufi path. And today, you can go to Data Sahib and see thousands of people who come to this writer's tomb to venerate him and sometimes pray to have their illnesses banished, etc. So Lahore and Pakistan have long been fertile territory for writers, and I found that to be the case personally. I then began to work on my next novel, which is called The Reluctant Fundamentalist, and I wrote the first draft of it when I was working in New York City. After Princeton, I went to law school. I went to Harvard Law. I never thought I could make a living writing books, and so I thought I would make a living as a writer. Discovered I didn't much like the law, and 3 years later, $100,000 in debt emerged, and I got a job as a management consultant in New York City. So I was paying off my loans, living in New York, and working on a novel. And I wrote this novel, which I gave to my agent in July 2001, around my 30th birthday. And the novel told the story about a Pakistani guy, a Muslim guy, living in New York City, working in a corporation, who grows a beard and goes back to Pakistan after a kind of disastrous love affair. And my agent didn't much like it, and he said, it doesn't work on multiple levels, and also I don't really buy this whole, this Pakistani guy, he feels this tension with America, where's that coming from? And he was right. It was actually the draft was, like my first book, Moth Smoke, took 7 years and 7 drafts. This book would also wind up taking 7 years and 7 drafts. This was the first draft, and my first drafts are always terrible. But then 2 months later, September 11th happened. The attacks of 9/11/2001, and about a month or two after that, my agent called and said, that book about the Muslim guy feeling this tension with America. The problem for me was I'd written a quiet little fable, almost a parable, about really just sort of a quiet love story, and a story of love for a place and love for a person, and the end of that love. And an investigation of what it's like to work in this corporate world, etc. But the events of 9/11 and the horrific terrorist atrocities of 9/11 and the wars that were unleashed subsequently and the horrors visited all around the world had overwhelmed my little quiet parable about this personal disenchantment. So for 2 or 3 years I couldn't really see incorporating 9/11 into my novel. I kept rewriting it and ending it as it originally ended in July 2001. Saying I don't want to deal with 9/11 and this whole war on terror stuff. The problem was that I kept having the impression that, whatever I did, if somebody read this book, here's a Muslim guy living in New York who leaves in July 2001, the end, the reader then says, I think would say, and then 9/11 happens, as though the whole book is sort of teeing up this off-screen event, which we all know is about to occur. The whole thing felt like a prologue to 9/11. And there was no question I could send it like 10 years earlier, because I didn't really know that period of New York City. So I was grappling with this, and eventually I said, okay, well, I will incorporate 9/11 into this book. So I moved the book back 1 year to take place during the year of 2001 and 2002. The question then became how to write it. And so I tried many different things. I tried writing it as an American accented first person, sort of like John Grisham's The Firm, except, the Tom Cruise guy is actually a Pakistani, protagonist. And I've seen the movie of The Firm. I haven't actually read the book. But I thought I would be like that. First 1/3 kid goes to good school, gets job at corporate firm, things become a bit sketchy, goes downhill. But that failed, as you can imagine, pretty horribly. And then, I tried writing it in third person. I tried all these different approaches. None were working. And a big part of why they weren't working was I didn't really want to say, this is what America is like, and this is what Muslims think, and here you go. I wanted to invite the reader to experience a space of ambiguity, which would hopefully allow the reader to reflect upon their own attitudes, towards this quote-unquote conflict. And how do you do that? So eventually I came up with the idea that the best way to do this is as a dramatic monologue, where the main character, Chingiz, is speaking to somebody who is presumably an American, stranger with a crew cut, fit-looking guy, maybe a CIA agent, maybe a bemused Canadian tourist wondering why the hell does this guy keep calling me an American. And so he would be speaking to this American character, but we would never hear what the American says back. So the dramatic monologue is like a one-man play where you stand on stage speaking to you, and you are some character, but the you never speaks back. And the nice thing about that was I thought, well, half the story is then missing. And the reader has to supply that half. And so the reader's always going to be destabilized, trying to figure out, how much do I trust this Chingiz guy? What's really going on? So that was one part of the solution that eventually made the novel work for me. The second thing was the voice. How should this character sound? And so I thought that, I sometimes describe The Reluctant Fundamentalist as a thriller in which nothing thrilling happens. That sort of by the end, hopefully, many reviews would say it's chilling and you're terrified and all. But actually, it's just two guys having a conversation. That's the entire book. But how to create that thriller effect? Where's the thrill going to come from? And I thought, the thrill will come from the voice of this character. Chingiz's voice, perhaps, can be made to resonate with certain preconceptions about Islam. And so I thought, what might a reader who is not Muslim imagine Islam to be if Islam were a voice? What would it sound like? Now, in a sense, that's an absurd question because, of course, there's billion-plus Muslims, and there's everything from the Taliban warriors to gay fashion designers to atheistic Muslims to people who are completely uninformed about their religious tradition. It's a diverse, as diverse as Christianity or any other religion. So there's no sound of Islam in reality. But there might be a sound of what people imagine Islam to be like, or some people imagine Islam to be like. The stereotype of Islam is a more coherent thing than Islam itself, obviously. So I thought, okay, what would it sound like? So maybe people think that Islam is this thing from the past. You know, it belongs to some older period. It's kind of old-fashioned in a way. And maybe people think that it is very strict. It's got like rules. It's very formal. And maybe people think it's vaguely menacing. So I thought, how about a voice which is sort of, feels like it comes from the past, is very formal, and has within it at least the potentiality of being read as menacing. And so the voice that I thought could do this is, in many of the private schools in Pakistan, the elite private schools that were set up by the British in the late Victorian period, you're taught English in a way which is like sort of a late 19th century English. Now, many people emerge from these schools speaking like me or with various kinds of mongrelized accents or other Pakistani accents. But every so often somebody pops out who speaks as though, you know, they went to Sandhurst in like 1870, like a British, you know, general or like duke. But from 100 years ago. And, you know, and living in Lahore, I would meet people like this and saying, you know, you've lived here your whole life? This is interesting. And I realized that partly people speak like that because the attempt is to convey a kind of class position. If you speak in a particularly proper British way, it means that you're an upper class person. And my character, Chingiz, had a good reason to speak like this because he was from a formerly upper class family that was broke. And so he felt insecure about that. So he's even more likely to try to use his accent to uphold his position or project a position in society. So that's where the voice came from. And anyway, this is what it sounds like, so it's less theoretical. Many of you will not have read this book. I'll just read you the first couple, like 1 or 2 pages, and it all goes on like this. This is chapter 1. Excuse me, sir, but may I be of assistance? Ah, I see I have alarmed you. I notice you are looking for something. More than looking, in fact, you seem to be on a mission. And since I am both a native of this city and a speaker of your language, I thought I might offer you my services. How did I know you were American? No, not by the color of your skin. We have a range of complexions in this country, and yours occurs often among the people of our northwest frontier. Nor was it your dress that gave you away. A European tourist could as easily have purchased in Des Moines your suit with its single vent and your button-down shirt. True, your hair, short-cropped, and your expansive chest, the chest, I would say, of a man who bench presses regularly and maxes out well above 225, are typical of a certain type of American. But then again, sportsmen and soldiers of all nationalities tend to look alike. Instead, it was your bearing that allowed me to identify you. And I do not mean that as an insult, for I see your face is hardened, but merely as an observation. Come, tell me, what were you looking for? Surely at this time of day, only one thing could have brought you to the district of Old Anarkali, named, as you may be aware, after a courtesan immured for loving a prince. And that is the quest for the perfect cup of tea. Now, whether the American is there really for tea or not is we shall find out. But the Reluctant Fundamentalist became... well, the reception of Reluctant Fundamentalist was very interesting for me. You know, it became a very popular book in a sense that many copies of Reluctant Fundamentalist were sold, and I think in part it entered into certain types of conversations. So unlike Moth Smoke, which had come out at a time when people were perhaps less interested in Pakistan in the United States or in Britain, Moth Smoke went on to become a kind of cult hit in South Asia. Lots of teenagers and 20-somethings would read it. I once went to a concert in India completely anonymously with, you know, hundreds of people, and somebody tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around and he said, "Are you Mohsin Hamid?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "You the guy who wrote Moth Smoke?" I said, "Yeah." And he took a joint out from behind his ear and says, "I really want to smoke this doobie with you." And that's when I knew that the youth had internalized the message of Moth Smoke. But the Reluctant Fundamentalist, in a sense, found a very wide readership also outside of South Asia, much more so than Moth Smoke had. And I think some people found it provocative. There are scenes in the book which perhaps do read as provocative. But I think, and I hope, that partly it allows people to experience themselves, in a way. That Reluctant Fundamentalist is kind of a mirror to the reader. And I think a lot of people seem to be interested in looking into that mirror and seeing what they found. At least that's what my understanding of perhaps why it became widely read in lots of different places. It then resulted in a movie. So the Indian film director Mira Nair approached me in London, and I was living there at the time. I moved to London in July 2001. In fact, once I came back to America a few months later, and at the immigration officer asked me, "So, you live in London now?" I said, "Yes." "When did you move to London?" "July 2001. "Oh, just before 9/11. To which I sort of said, "Yes." It seemed very ominous, as though you must have known. You got out just in time, didn't you? But anyway, it was one of those odd things. So yeah, I moved just before September 11th. I experienced September 11th outside of the U.S. In fact, my ex-roommate worked in the World Financial Center, and for a while couldn't get through to her. And so I had a very, as a New Yorker, I was no longer living in New York. I had left New York before this event. Mira Nair approached me, and Mira Nair was a director I admired. I really enjoyed Monsoon Wedding, among other films, and I thought Salam Bombay was really a spectacular film and groundbreaking in so many ways for South Asian cinema. I think it's the first Oscar-nominated film from South Asia, although I might be wrong about that. But so she approached me and saying she wanted to adapt this film. And we met, and she's a Punjabi, and her father was from Lahore, and she had a real love for the city. And she, her husband, Mahmood Mamdani, was a Columbia University professor, still is. Her son Zoran, young man of both Muslim and Hindu heritage. So Mira, in a sense, wanted to enter into this world of Lahore that she felt a kind of familiar attachment to, and also enter into this conversation which she saw had, in a sense, swept up not just her husband but her son, who was now being stopped at airports all around the world, etc. As a potential Muslim himself. And so she wanted to make a film about this. And it was an incredibly difficult project. First of all, it was difficult to adapt because the book doesn't really lend itself to being a film. It's sort of a one-man show where effectively, if you did it faithfully, you just see the camera looking at one guy standing in a cafe, talking at the camera and pretending the camera was an American. As Mira told me, that had very limited cinematic potential. So she wanted to have a new frame for it, a new structure for it. Along the way, all kinds of hurdles had to be crossed. So, for example, she talked to some, great Hollywood screenwriters, very well-known people who won big awards, and one of them said, in a way which is kind of typical, he said to her, he had a problem with the title, and he said, "Mira, there ain't no such thing as a reluctant fundamentalist." And she said, "Well, I'll get back to you," and didn't work out. And so eventually what she found was it was almost impossible to get somebody who could both write corporate Wall Street type life and South Asian, family life, and also a thriller, because she wanted to be a thriller. So she asked me to collaborate with her and Ami Bogani, who was at the time her assistant, to co-write a first draft, which I did, and then hand it over to Bill Wheeler, an LA-based screenwriter, to then take it forward. Also, getting the thing financed was next to impossible. So nobody in America wanted to finance this film with this brown Muslim guy as the protagonist, and who behaves really in some not so nice ways along the way. And also Indian film financiers who were dying to finance Mira's next film, etc., suddenly disappeared when this became the next film. And in the end, there were a variety of financiers from the Middle East and Turkey who signed up, but some of them fell through. But eventually it did get financed. But then they couldn't get an insurance bond to cover shooting in Pakistan. So the film was never to take Mira and the crew and the cast to Pakistan. No insurance company would underwrite that. And you can't do a film which is not underwritten by insurance, because if something were to happen, the financiers wouldn't get their money back. So what the compromise that was reached was a second crew would film exteriors in Lahore, and the primary shooting of Lahore scenes would happen in Delhi, with a bunch of us flying over from Lahore to Delhi to help with that. So there were many, many challenges. One of the biggest changes was that in the book, we don't know who the American is. And we don't really know what happens at the end. In the movie, they wanted an ending where we do know what happens. And the American was played by Liev Schreiber and has an actual backstory and events, and there's actual CIA, snipers and all that kind of stuff emerging. So in that sense, the film didn't have the same ambiguity as the novel. But the ambiguity of the novel functions in a way to hopefully break down these silos that we pretend to find ourselves inside of, Muslim, American, Pakistani, whatever, and helps us transcend, I would hope, transcend a little bit of that silo mentality. I think the film did that in a very different way, because, never before that I'm aware of have you had an Indian film director taking on a novel written by a Pakistani writer, having a British Pakistani actor, Riz Ahmed, who was brilliant in the lead. His parents played by a pair of Indian actors, Shabana Azmi and Om Puri, and having in a supporting role Kate Hudson, Kiefer Sutherland, and Liev Schreiber. Normally in a film which has Kate Hudson, Kiefer Sutherland, Liev Schreiber, and Riz Ahmed gets shot 30 minutes in and is dead, right? And then we continue with the other three in the lead. But in this case, of course, Riz is in the lead, which is a real act of generosity in a way on the part of those actors to agree to come on board in a film where they are all leading actors, where in a sense they're playing a supporting role. And of course we had Pakistani actors like Misha Shafi. So, and we had a cast, we had a crew from all over the world, South Africa, Britain, America, India, Pakistan. So in a sense, the making of the film involved, I think, a similar kind of transcending of silos and showing that people from all over the place could come together and make something that hopefully is powerful and beautiful. And so it operated in a different way from the novel, but I think, for me, was a gesture that was very complementary to the novel. I won't say much more about it because I think we're running out of time. I'll just say a few last words about my most recent novel, which is called How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia is a self-help book. Now, it pretends to be a self-help book that tells you how to get filthy rich in rising Asia. Actually, it doesn't pretend. It kind of is a self-help book that tells you how to get filthy rich in rising Asia. But it really follows the arc of a human being's life, a young boy, from his childhood until the end of his life, of old age, who's migrated to some city. And I used as my model Lahore, but I intentionally didn't use any names in the book, so it could be set in really any big city in South Asia. Many people in India and elsewhere have said, oh, this seems like my city. In fact, a Mexican team has optioned the film rights to the book, and the first thing they said to me was, this could be set in Mexico City, which I liked, because I felt, too often, if you write about Pakistan or Lahore, there's a kind of exoticization that takes place. So this is interesting because it's exotic. But I was more interested in saying, well, this is a book about the city and about the mass migration of 1 billion people who are going to move to large cities in the next decade or two. A scale of migration within countries which is many, many times bigger than migration between countries. We hear a lot about people moving to America from Mexico, or moving to Europe from North Africa. But those movements are actually very small compared to the number of people moving from rural Pakistan to urban Pakistan, or rural China to urban China, or rural India, or rural Nigeria to urban India and Nigeria. So I wanted to write about that, about the new city that was emerging. And I thought, instead of Lahore being this exotic place, why not use Lahore as a template for the universal city? If you write about the city, if you say New York, it's immediately assumed that you're talking about every city in the world. You can use New York as a template. But why can't Lahore be a universal city? So I wanted to sort of explore the idea that maybe every place is as central and as universal as every other place. And in fact, perhaps there are more cities in the world like Lahore than there are cities like New York, in fact. So that was then the idea for this novel. But given the particular context in which we're speaking today, with the Abbasi program Islamic Studies having asked me to give this talk, I want to speak about one other aspect of the novel, which was, it's sort of a self-help book about how to get rich, but not really. In a deeper sense, for me, the idea was, maybe all novels are self-help books. And how so? Well, why do I write novels? My job consists of sitting by myself in a room for hours a day, for years at a time, staring at a wall, making stuff up, quietly. That's a very bizarre behavior for any 42-year-old, man to be engaged in. It's a pretty weird thing to do with your time. So clearly, it's meeting some need for me. Writing fiction is doing something for me. There's something about this practice which is personally helping, I hope. But also reading, I think, in a sense, because it allows you to transcend your own experience and to introduce into your mind the place where you keep your thoughts, the thoughts of another human being. There's a certain kind of transcendent impulse in reading a novel. We talk about self-help. But self-help is, in a sense, often a narcissistic category. Everybody knows self-help. I don't really read self-help books, but any newspaper or magazine you open will be full of self-help. How to have six-pack abs, how to be a fantastic lover, how to live to 100. But these are all narcissistic projects. The problem with these kinds of self-help models is that the self is going to end. We will all die, and the more centered we are in the self, in a sense, the more terrifying this predicament becomes. And it seems to me that on the one hand we have the market, which is getting more and more powerful everywhere, and the market is about acting in your self-interest, and it sort of reinforces the self. And then we have traditions like religious traditions, spiritual traditions, philosophical traditions, cultural traditions that have been about mitigating the self, about saying, look, the self isn't really all that important. Don't get too hung up on the self. But unfortunately, as we see sort of the degree of politicization of religion that's taking place in the current moment, it seems that a lot of religion is becoming about group dynamics. In other words, are you a Muslim? Are you not a Muslim? Are you a Christian? Are you not a Christian? If you're a Christian, are you Catholic or Protestant? What kind of Protestant are you? What kind of Sunni are you? As opposed to saying that we are all united by a kind of predicament of being human, and these various different traditions offer us ways to feel less overwhelmed by that predicament. We're seeing a kind of worldwide movement to rejecting that commonality in a way, and in the process also rejecting the core power of religion, which is to make mortal life more bearable. So I thought that this is something which I wanted to explore whether fiction could deal with and novels could deal with. But of course I wasn't the first person to have this idea, because the dominant literary form where I live in Lahore, Pakistan, has for many centuries been the Sufi love poem. And sort of, for those of you who aren't familiar with Sufism, Sufism is a mystical strand within the Muslim tradition that tends to, there's many different variations, but to generalize unfairly, that tends to use love as a lens for trying to comprehend the universe, comprehend one's relationship to the world, to the divine. And because of the difference oftentimes between Sufi positions and orthodox positions, or the positions of the orthodoxy in power, very often Sufi texts, as opposed to being a direct manual saying, this is how you become a good Sufi, or this is how you achieve unity with the universe, express themselves through poems and fiction, but particularly epic poems. So we have works by writers such as Rumi, which still exist and are massively popular even today. And I wanted to sort of explore creating a text that was, in a sense, a of that tradition, yet without necessarily being grounded in any religious specificity. So I wanted to write a novel which didn't require you to believe in God or to believe in being a Muslim or being a Sufi or any of this kind of stuff, but yet adopted a similar view that a certain degree of transcendence might be possible. And if so, how do you find it? How do we find it? Can the act of reading offer that transcendence? Can the act of writing offer that transcendence? Are there types of love that might offer that kind of transcendence? And you have to read the book to know if you think it works. I'll just read you, as I stop now, a couple of pages, then we'll have some questions. But for me, I think it's very important to not allow there to be this divide between a kind of secular space and a religious space, where there's just two different conversations happening separately. I think the danger of that divide is it leaves these issues insufficiently addressed. And so, for example, often in a militantly atheist position that you'll hear people expounding, saying that there is no such thing as this, that, the other, your faith is ridiculous, etc. I tend to find that that position not very helpful at a certain level, because even if you believe that people's faith is wrong, it's very difficult to come to the conclusion that the impulse to have faith doesn't exist. Clearly, a vast majority of people on planet Earth do feel the impulse to have faith. That comes from something, and you have to address that impulse. But similarly, on the religious side, to not engage in this kind of secular conversations about these sorts of issues is, I think, also a mistake. And the collective mistake on both, in much religious discourse and much non-religious discourse, I think, is leaving in the contemporary world this huge lacuna. And the result of that is a kind of, if you're religious, a massive spiritual crisis on planet Earth. And if you're not religious, I think it's a massive mental health crisis. It's the same thing, where you have really an epidemic of depression, and I think there's not really that much difference psychically or psychologically between the young teenage boy who walks into a shopping mall in Lahore with a suicide bomb vest on and laces his arm and blows himself up and kills 15 other people, and the young teenager who walks into a school in Colorado and guns down 15 of his peers. Of course, the politics is different, the context is different, but I suspect that the mental health and or spiritual position actually is quite similar. So I think it's important to talk about this stuff, because I think our world is hurtling into a place where, as we ignore these things, we are entering kind of monstrous terrain. So I'm going to stop there. I'll just read to you one or two pages, and then I'll take questions. And in particular, I'd love to have questions from students at Stanford. It's always a particular pleasure to get a chance to speak to college students. So this is the very beginning of How to Get Filthy Rich and Rising Age. Each chapter in this book there's 12 chapters, and each one is a kind of self-help maxim. The first one is move to the city, the second one is get an education, the third one is don't fall in love, the fourth one is etc., etc. This is chapter 1, move to the city. Look, unless you're writing one, a self-help book is an oxymoron. You read a self-help book so someone who isn't yourself can help you. That someone being the author. This is true of the whole self-help genre. It's true of how-to books, for example. And it's true of personal improvement books, too. Some might even say it's true of religion books. But some others might say that those who say that should be pinned to the ground and bled dry with a slow slice of a blade across their throats. So it's wisest simply to note a divergence of views on that subcategory and move swiftly on. None of the foregoing means self-help books are useless. On the contrary, they can be useful indeed. But it does mean that the idea of self in the land of self-help is a slippery one. And slippery can be good. Slippery can be pleasurable. Slippery can provide access to what would chafe if entered dry. This book is a self-help book. Its objective, as it says on the cover, is to show you how to get filthy rich in rising Asia. And to do that, it has to find you, huddled, shivering, on the packed earth under your mother's cot one cold, dewy morning. Your anguish is the anguish of a boy whose chocolate has been thrown away, whose remote controls are out of batteries, whose scooter is busted, whose new sneakers have been stolen. This is all the more remarkable since you've never in your life seen any of these things. The whites of your eyes are yellow, a consequence of spiking bilirubin levels in your blood. The virus afflicting you is called hepatitis E. Its typical mode of transmission is fecal oral. Yum. It kills only about 1 in 50, so you're likely to recover, but right now you feel like you're going to die. Your mother's encountered this condition many times, or conditions like it anyway, so maybe she doesn't think you're going to die. Then again, maybe she does. Maybe she fears it. Everyone is going to die. And when a mother like yours sees in a third-born child like you the pain that makes you whimper under her cot the way you do, maybe she feels your death push forward a few decades, take off its dark, dusty headscarf, and settle with open-haired familiarity and a lascivious smile into this, the single mud-walled room she shares with all of her surviving offspring. What she says is, don't leave us here. I'll stop there, and would love to get some questions.